Hey, so we are fully into March at this point, but before we get all the way into the month, let's do a quick swing back around to February to wrap up the 10 books that I read during February. And we're going to start that wrap up with the first book I read in February because The Sound of Music tells us that the beginning is the very best place to start, and that is The Stolen Heir by Holly Black. This is the new duology following the Cruel Prince trilogy, following Oak, Jude's brother, from that original trilogy. And so it's kind of the next generation of sorts, shorter generations, but generations nonetheless, of this world. Looking at the next generation in a book series you really loved for when you want to feel old. Although I guess Tamora Pierce was doing it when I was a teenager and it didn't make me feel old. Granted, I'm not nearly as well read in Tamora Pierce as I should be. I read and own the Trickster's Choice duology, but haven't gone back to all of the original books, which I probably need to. I think I've read Squire maybe. Irregardless, tangent. We are of course talking about the Stolen Heir duology, which focuses on Oak and Surin Wren, who is or was the queen of the Court of Teeth, the Child Queen. I admittedly don't remember much about her from the original trilogy, and I've only read the trilogy like once. I maybe reread The Cruel Prince, I don't remember. So that kind of makes sense. I think to my recollection, she maybe made an appearance because it was really about the kind of political machinations, particularly of her mother, that we were focused on in that trilogy. And this book really does bring us back into the politicking of this world, which is what the original trilogy was really focused on. I know the romance is talked about a lot. It kept me going as a reader too, but the kind of political intrigue of everything, the kind of reversals of allegiances and who you can trust and who you can't, and all of that being compounded by being in the realm of the Fae and this idea that you can't tell lies, but how can you tell lies without telling lies? It makes for compelling twists and turns. And so here, a lot of it going in was, what are those twists and turns going to be? And we start with Wren. We get this backstory of her being kind of abandoned as a very, very young child and being taken in by this human family and then being ripped from that family and taken into the Court of Teeth, and how abused she was there. And so a lot of the exploration of this book is really looking at Surin Wren kind of overcoming that trauma and also kind of claiming power in her own way when she has spent her entire life being a pawn. So while Oak is definitely a part of things, the way that it reads, the plotting, the focus, this isn't his book. And some of that may be that we are kind of outside of his head for this, partly because he is the instigator of a lot of the twists and turns. Now granted, I saw the twists, or the big twist, so to speak, coming, because there was really only one way for it to go based on how everything was leading up. It didn't take away necessarily from the impact of that, the revelation of that. It did make me question some of the allegiances though, and oddly enough, not in the trusting, whether it felt a little forced in kind of creating this atmosphere of mistrust and this kind of will they, won't they with Wren and Oak in particular, but I don't know. We'll see, I think, a lot in the second book, especially because this book was about going to the Court of Teeth. We're in the midst, or our goal, well, Oak's goal, is to rescue his father, Maddock. And I won't lie to you, I don't care about Maddock. Maddock? You know who I'm talking about if you've read the books. And there were plenty of references to people I did care about, mostly, you know, Jude and Carden, but they didn't make appearances here. And I think that that bummed a lot of readers out, and I will admit to having some disappointment around that because of course I wanted to see them. However, I do think it was smart not seeing them. We get a sense of kind of where the politics of the world are standing right now through the conversations. We know that Jude still really is holding power. Kind of balance of power is where we've left it, but there is this question of whether certain people will step aside for certain other people. Trying not to spoil the Cruel Prince trilogy if you haven't read it. So there is this sense that we are at this kind of pressure moment of potential change. And of course there's going to be some kind of change, because why would you set a series up without the potential for change? Conflict brings change. So this book allows us to get to know these characters outside of the kind of touchstones of the series that we love as readers. And so it allows us to get to know these people in their own world, so to speak. Kind of going for more of a spin-off than a continuation, though we do get some kind of flashback peeks into moments around the kind of final showdown and the leading up to the final showdown in the original trilogy that we didn't get the insight into before. So there are those moments that provide a little bit new perspective, but as a whole, this book is focused on us getting to know these characters. Where I think this struggles is that, one, we as readers are kind kind of primed for these twists and revelations to happen. We know that there's going to be some kind of reversal, some kind of trick, some kind of twist at the end. We have this idea that allegiances aren't fully solid, and so we don't know who we can trust, and this also keeps us from getting to know these characters. Now, in the original trilogy, we could potentially argue the same, but we're getting to know the characters through especially Jude's point of view and perception at every moment. And here, especially with Oak feels a little distant and unknowable in a way that almost feels a little too reminiscent of Cardan. And I do think that that was a really unique challenge because he was such a strong character. So this kind of aloofness, this idea that we're not seeing fully into him, that all kind of feels familiar. So when we are being kept at arm's distance from getting to know Oak fully, then we are more likely as readers, or I was, I guess I can only speak to my experience as always, then we're a little more likely to transpose Cardan's characteristics onto Oak. There were still pieces to differentiate. For instance, Oak's kind of bloodlust once he is in that moment of battle that he kind of tries to avoid getting into, but still obviously relishes, and that is clearly being traced back to him being raised around a red cap. So there are these moments that differentiate him from Cardan, but there are also a lot of similarities, which admittedly do make sense because he is being raised around Cardan. So he is kind of absorbing a lot of those characteristics in the same way that he inherited those characteristics from his father related to battle. So I think that the second book is going to reveal him a lot more. I think we are supposed to be kept a little guarded from him in this book, especially because we spent so much time and needed time kind of setting up Ren. And I think that that was time well spent. I really enjoyed spending time with her as a character. As a character, she starts very much in this fight or flight mentality, especially based on all of the kind of trauma she has experienced. And so over the course of the book, we watch her really find herself in a way and kind of step in to the fight of things and being willing to fight for herself and her future. So I will be very, very interested to see how the second book continues and what dynamic it forwards, particularly between Ren and Oak, because we do have a little bit of that flirtation, this idea that they are drawn to each other and they have been drawn to each other since they were children, but that there is also these political barriers standing between them in some way, and the end of the book only exacerbates these barriers. So I will be interested to see what book 2 holds, how the revelations of book 1 continue to develop in book 2, whether we get to see Jude and Cardan in book 2, which I have a sneaky suspicion we will, because I think based on the fact that it is a duology, if nothing else, everything will be coming to a head in the final moments. So I do think we'll get to see them. And it was a lot of fun playing in this familiar world, though completely different realms of this familiar world than we've really been in before. That being said, I think your enjoyment of this book is really going to be predicated on your enjoyment of the original trilogy. I think that this is very much for readers of the original series, but I don't know, at least so far, that it really eclipses anything from the original series. So if you've read this, especially if you're a fan of the original trilogy, I will definitely be interested to hear what you think of this so far. And if by any chance you are a reader who hasn't read the original trilogy, but read this one, I would be super interested to hear your take on it as well, obviously. And then I read The Davenports by Crystal Marquis, which we already talked about, and this takes place in 1910, so like Gilded Age Chicago, and it is anchored by a prominent Black family, the Davenports, who have made their fortune in the carriage business in Chicago. And so we follow 4 young women that are connected to this family, the 2 Davenport daughters, a friend of the family whose father is running to be the first Black mayor of Chicago, and a maid that they grew up with who has aspirations of opening up her own hair salon, which makes me think and hope that we may be setting up a kind of Madam C.J. Walker storyline for her. I think this is going to be perfect for YA readers who are fans of Bridgerton, or maybe were fans of like the Lux series that came out in the 2000s. It's a little bit more Lux to my recollection in terms of its storytelling, in that we are following all 4 of our young women concurrently. So that is both, I think, a strength and a weakness, unfortunately, of this. I think it was a definite strength in that it introduced us to 4 young women who come from varied circumstances, though 3 of them are from a more privileged background, but they have different interests, they have different kind of stressors and societal expectations that are weighing on them, and to whatever degree these kind of expectations and societal expectations are kind of charting their future for all of them. So we're watching them all kind of assess their current reality and deciding what they want for their future. Now, all of their storylines kind of weave in and and out of each other. For instance, Ruby, the friend of the family, has this expectation from her parents and from the Davenport parents that she will be marrying the Davenport son. But he has a crush on the maid, Amy Rose. She has a crush on him, but kind of class difference is really playing into things. And so Ruby starts a flirtation with another boy to kind of make him jealous and ends up falling for this other guy. And so in this storyline in particular, we have this real opportunity, or the narrative kind of sets up that these two women may be on opposite sides, right? They have a similar purpose at the outset or a similar want. And so it would be so easy to pit them against each other. And this narrative doesn't go that route. And I think that there's something really special in that. Additionally, like I said, the narratives kind of weave in and out of each other. So you couldn't really separate this into 4 books like you would in a romance series and follow each young woman separately, because things that are happening in one young woman's storyline directly impact in real time another character's storyline. So for instance, something like The Wallflowers by Lisa Kleypas, sure, in book 2, we have something that happens that directly impacts action in book 3, but it's something that we're reacting to in book 3 and kind of reflecting back on book 2 in. It's not like that action is happening at the same time. Now, some romance series do kind of maneuver this a little more successfully, but here I don't know that it would have worked to the same extent. Now, that is also unfortunately where it becomes a slight hindrance to the work too. Because we have 4 storylines going on, we sometimes skip what feels like really substantial development in some of the storylines. For instance, the oldest daughter of the Davenport family, Olivia, gets involved with protesting and the civil rights movement of the time, but we don't really get to see her become acclimated fully to that community. And there is a romance associated with that. It feels like we're just popping in and out, and so we're not getting to see that grow as naturally, and that takes away from some of the power of some of it, but I think it all still really works, especially because I think the best part of this, though it is inherently a romance, and we can kind of chart the couples that we're supposed to be on the watch for very early, even with these complications and attempts to kind of show triangles or other shapes. I think that the real strength of this lies in the female relationships here and the bonds and the way these young women are kind of stepping into their own and kind of reassessing their current reality. For instance, we see Olivia and Helen kind of stop and have to assess how their relationship with Amy Rose, the maid, has changed as they've kind of moved into the social stratification of their relative circumstances. So yeah, though there are parts that I think unfortunately just move a little too quickly, I would have liked to see them developed more. This was at the end of the day a lot of fun to get to know these young women, and I think that this is going to be a lot of fun for readers, and I think it's going to fit the need for that kind of escapist look into high society while not completely removing ourselves from the social realities of the time. I think that this strikes a really nice balance. It acknowledges the history of the time, and it gives us a peek into some history that we may not be as familiar with. So I will definitely be tuning into book 2, if nothing else, to see if we get our Harold Washington type leader elected, or if we are going to be sticking to the more historical timeline for that, and whether Amy Rose gets her kind of Madam C.J. Walker type moment, as well as how all of these romances kind of shake out in book 2. So we'll definitely be keeping my eye on this. And then I read Lunar Love by Lauren Kung Jessen, which I talked about in my vlog last month, so some of you got to watch my reaction to that in real time, and unfortunately this one just didn't work for me. It follows Olivia, a young woman who has recently inherited her grandmother's matchmaking business, and this matchmaking business is rooted in Chinese zodiac tradition and is a more traditional matchmaking business as well, because her business is upset by meeting Bennett O'Brien, both her personal life and her business life. Because in her personal life, she runs into him in a bakery and he kind of upsets her norm. There's some flirtation. She's potentially interested in running into him again, until she actually does run into him again and realizes he is running an app based on matching people based on the Chinese zodiac. And so now he's a direct competitor for a family business that is already kind of struggling, and she also views his app as kind of almost insulting. And so things spiral. There are interactions, and they end up in like this bet where they bet that they can find the other person a perfect match through their respective methods, and there are business benefits to winning this bet. However, of course, emotions become involved. Where I struggled with this, and again, I talked about this more in the vlog as well, is one, we are only getting Olivia's point of view. And that was kind of extra hard for me in this instance because her point of view kind of felt so irrational, or we weren't given the full picture as readers. Her thinking was just kind of very black and white, and while we understood her desire to keep this business running, not letting it fail on her watch, the fact that there was this family history here, we as readers, or I as a reader, didn't get a real sense of her connection to the business, to matchmaking, her love of finding love for others. There was some backstory stuff that kind of dug into that, but she did a lot of things for kind of like the sake of the business that felt a little mean-spirited. And as an outside observer, without a business degree, it felt like she was viewing this app as her one obstacle in a way that just wasn't realistic. And so she didn't even like stop to consider that maybe they were appealing to different types of customers and how she could reach her customer. I don't know. It just felt a little forced in terms of the conflict there. And then the action she was taking based on the conflict felt a little outsized and, like I said, a little mean. And so then only being able to see her side of it, it just didn't feel natural, and I wasn't really rooting for her at the end of the day. And that was a huge bummer because the concept was really promising, and I was hoping that this would be like the successful version of another kind of rival apps romance I read that also didn't work for me, that kind of failed for me personally for a lot of the same reasons. So I will keep my eye out for like a rival apps romance that maybe doesn't fall into some of these more mean-spirited pitfalls or kind of one-sided flat pitfalls. But the concept of this was really great, so maybe you're still interested, and if you have a different response to it, definitely let me know. And then I read a young adult contemporary romance, which I haven't been reading a whole lot of lately, Love Radio by Ebony Liddell, and this was utterly delightful. All of the positive reviews for this are completely warranted. It follows two teens, Danny and Prince, as they are kind of on the precipice of their senior year of looking to the future. Danny dreams of becoming a famous writer, but her writing is kind of stuck currently based on something that has happened to her within the last year. Prince is a popular teen love advice DJ in Detroit who is just coming off of a recent breakup, but has also had a long-standing crush on Danny from afar. And so when he runs into her at the library one day when he's looking for picture books for his little brother, fate kind of throws them together. However, they don't get off on the best foot based on some kind of snap judgments that Danny makes. And she has to kind of swallow her pride a little bit and apologize, and this leads them to this kind of flirtation, and Prince gets her to agree to 3 dates to fall in love with him. And while Danny doesn't want to agree to this, Prince is very earnest, and she doesn't believe in love, so she figures no harm, no foul. But then feelings get involved, things get complicated, they have a lot of fun at the roller rink if nothing else, and both are kind of having to consider their futures in a way that Danny is only kind of looking to the future and avoiding the present because dealing with the present means dealing with the past, and Prince is avoiding looking at the future and really rooting himself in the current moment because if he thinks about the future, he has to think about his dreams and what his dreams mean in the context of him being the main caregiver for his mother with MS. So this book is balanced so perfectly with this kind of like butterfly new love, and one thing I do love about this is that it shows dating. It shows these teens kind of pursuing each other. They don't immediately know. There isn't this like fate. They're figuring it out as they go. And so we get to see that process of dating. And like I said, it leads to some great moments, including one of my favorite scenes, which takes place at a roller rink, because come on, how can you not be infected by the energy of a roller rink? It's just something so nostalgic. I haven't been to a roller rink in way too long. I would be like Danny, where I would be falling on my butt and being mowed down by a child, but it was fun to read about. And so we get some of that joy of discovery, and that's what helps us work through some of the heavier stuff that the book is also exploring. So I think it just has a really nice balance that really acknowledges where these teens are at. And sure, there are moments that stretch credulity. Credulity? We're gonna go with it. For instance, like Danny's parents have an amazing marriage and relationship. Her mother loves love, and yet Danny hates romance and doesn't believe in love. You thought I was gonna say that Prince is a really popular teen DJ, but I had no suspension of disbelief there. My only suspension of disbelief there, or in terms of that circumstance, is how many people are still listening to traditional radio, and the fact that it didn't like talk, or at least I don't remember it talking about maybe like throwing up podcasts or throwing up his show in other forms on social media. I think it did talk about his TikTok a little bit. But I actually really enjoyed this idea of him as a local celebrity, especially with him like at the roller rink because his uncle was DJing. His uncle is also a super popular DJ and is who got his foot through the door, so it all made sense to me. But this was a lot of fun and just a perfect kind of re-entry into young adult contemporary romance for me. And then I read Mysteries of Thorne Manor by Margaret Rogerson, which is a novella kind of follow-up to Sorcery of Thorns. And this is a very contained story, and it takes place in this house, their house, Elizabeth, Nathaniel, Silas, and the crew, as they are kind of trapped in by magic and the shrubbery and this house kind of trying to tell them something. And that thing may be partly that Nathaniel has failed to tell them that he is supposed to be hosting like this magician's ball. So they have a time frame in which they have to get this stuff figured out, especially because they do need to go outside to get groceries, so they cannot be constantly attacked by shrubbery. And so this leads them to kind of explore the house and the history of Nathaniel's family, which is fun because we have this idea of like hidden rooms. We get to explore these sentient books again and Elizabeth caring for these books again, which is part of what was so fun in the first. We have Silas back. I will admit that I thought I remembered a more present love triangle in the first book, and this one was really more focused on Elizabeth and Nathaniel's relationship, while still kind of exploring this kind of unnameable relationship with Silas, which I think also kind of makes sense, especially because this book did talk a lot about how Silas kind of cared for Nathaniel in his childhood, so that would have felt a little different with different contexts for sure. So this definitely felt like a For the Fans continuation. I definitely had Howl's Moving Castle vibes with this one. It has been a while since I read the first book and I didn't go back, so there were times where I definitely felt like I was missing something, but it did still reference things in the first book to kind of help me orient myself. I had a good time, but I did read a lot of this book on the treadmill at the gym, and I have not visited the treadmill at the gym as often as that statement would have you think, so I would definitely borrow versus buy this one. But if you really loved Sorcery of Thorns and are looking to complete that collection, it looks like the hardcover novella is about the price of a standard paperback, and if it's something that you'd revisit as a kind of comfort fun read, that is definitely a good investment, so something to keep your eye on. But otherwise, I would definitely check it out of the library and have a grand old time. And then I read By the Book by Jasmine Guillory, which I did on audio, and when I left off my vlog last month, I was close to done, halfway done, I don't remember. This is from the Meant to Be series, which is retakes on fairy tales or Disney movies through the lens of popular modern contemporary writers, or they're at least writing it as a contemporary romance. And this was our Beauty and the Beast story, which followed a publishing professional as she basically had to go chase down a manuscript out of a former child star, and how they were kind of isolated in his house writing this book. A lot of the Beauty and the Beast references were to, of course, the movie in particular, and they came about in little throwaway lines like the television program they were watching, which I think was This Provincial Life, but don't quote me on that. So it was those kind of references. And we had similar plot beats, but I would argue that Guillory took a little bit more liberty with the Beauty and the Beast structure and what we're used to the Beauty and the Beast structure being in terms of things that consider themselves kind of retellings or modernizations of Beauty and the Beast. And I think that that was smart. I think that taking those risks and making those changes reads really well. I thought it was a lot of fun. It definitely did get steamier from where I left off, though wasn't full steam by any means. I also forgot how much character development and kind of like bonding and shifting happens around food in Guillory novels. So especially toward the end, I was like very aware every time food was referenced. So I found that very interesting. I don't really have a takeaway from that. It was just something that I noticed. And I do need to catch back up with Guillory's other current work. So I haven't tracked that past her first couple of books where it was definitely very prominent as well. So that's kind of the extent of my observation there, but I thought it was just an easy listen, especially because it was something that was somewhat familiar structurally, even with the kind of playing of the beats. So there was some kind of narrative safety in that. I didn't feel as lost. But if you're looking for something that's just kind of an easy, quick read, feels familiar, but also fresh at the same time, I think this is a good option, especially if you like Disney. And then I read The Fraud Squad by Kyla Zhao, which we have already talked about on a Feature Friday, and unfortunately this one was a miss for me. It follows Samantha, who is a kind of junior PR professional in Singapore, and she's kind of obsessed with the lives of the elite, especially through the lens of one particular magazine that she really wants to write for, and is why she's at this PR firm in the first place, because they're owned by the same parent company, and she thought that it would position her to maybe move to that magazine someday. And this magazine and this kind of look into the lives of the rich and the famous is a kind of escape from her reality and circumstances and the poverty that her and her mother have been living in since since the death of her father. And she's given an extra kind of glimpse into this world through a friend she's made at work that is on the outskirts of society herself. And this is where she gets invited to dinner with the heir of one of the biggest fortunes in the city, and they kind of concoct this plan to launch Samantha into society, to make her the it girl of society. And they do this partly in an effort to prove something to Timothy, the guy's parents, because his parents want him to work at the family firm and he doesn't want that. So they're basically kind of playing with this idea of perception, and they're making a point with it. And Samantha's ultimate goal is to work at this magazine. Now, I think that they kind of explore the logic of this within the novel a little bit. I still don't totally buy it, because I think that a major magazine editor who covers this part of society is going to recognize that you kind of launched yourself as a socialite and weren't, and I don't know. I just don't think that they thought that all the way through, and that's kind of how a lot of the novel feels. It's very superficial, and I don't mind that inherently. I wanted the escapism of it, but it didn't feel really like it moved either in the realm of escapism fully or in kind of the social commentary. And I think that you can do the social commentary on top of the escapism, but again, this all felt so superficial, and everything kind of came so easily to Samantha, and I don't believe that these people in this society wouldn't be asking questions. And it wasn't absurd and comical to the point of satire like in Crazy Rich Asians, because they were almost kind of laughing at the extremism of that lifestyle at the same time that there are still sympathetic characters, but there are also characters built in to be this kind of embodiment of the extremism of everything. And in something like Gossip Girl, which admittedly I didn't like that series and I've only read the first book, but I did watch the TV show for a couple seasons, and it is a cultural touchstone. Also, I keep telling myself I'm going to revisit that series because as I've gotten older, I've recognized a lot more of the Edith Wharton connections and would love to kind of look at it through that lens. I just haven't gotten around to it. But there we have this kind of idea of watching awful people do awful things. So it doesn't really fall on either side of the fence, nor does it straddle the fence successfully. And I think part of it is that it doesn't really know its audience. I would say it's trying to be new adult, but I don't really know how successful that is as a category. But it feels too immature and naive to be adult. It doesn't have the same kind of bite. It doesn't feel like Samantha is really getting one over on these people. She really earnestly wants to be a part of this world, and she does some kind of mean things to people in her life because of it, and it feels a little bit immature. It feels like something that would land us in this kind of genre of, you know, just the regular girl getting a peek into the extravagant life. And there is a history of things like that in young adult. All-American Girl by Meg Cabot, I would argue. What was the book that came out in like the 2010s about the regular girl who got a modeling contract? Things along those lines. But this just wasn't any of those for me successfully, unfortunately. Additionally, it came out of Berkeley, I think, which I consider a romance imprint, or at least the storylines lean into romance plot lines. And there was a romance plot line in this, and I felt it was very lackluster. So the whole thing was unfortunately just not what I had hoped. And I feel bad saying that, but at the end of the day, I just don't think it worked. But if you had a different reading experience, I would love to hear what you thought. And then because HarperCollins finally got their heads out of their butts, or their heads were forced from their butts, either way, I finally read To Catch a Raven by Beverly Jenkins, which is the third in the Women Who Dare series. And this follows Raven Moreau, who descends from a family famous for their cons, the same family that we get a peek into in Destiny's Captive, and Braxton, a tailor from a wealthy family in the North. And they're blackmailed by a dodgy Pinkerton agent into recovering this stolen copy of the Declaration of Independence from a Southern politician. And so they have to go undercover as servants to recover this, and in the meantime have to pretend to be married. But upon meeting, they do not get along. Braxton kind of internally questions Raven's morals and isn't so great at hiding that on his face, and Raven views Braxton as stuck up and judgy, considering he is not fully aware of other people's circumstances. But they end up kind of warming to each other, especially by the time they end up on this mission. And the mission actually takes a lot less time in the book than you'd think it would. As usual, Jenkins is really great at creating community here, and we spend a lot of time with those communities. There are definite threads from other books here, some I recognized and some from books I haven't gotten to yet, but definitely recognize the references. For instance, we definitely hear about the Levesque family, who I know is very prominent in Beverly Jenkins's work. They are involved in the first book in this series, which I absolutely love because the hero offers to build the heroine a schoolhouse, and like, how could you not? But even in that book, you can tell there is an extensive history with that family within this world. So we spend a lot of time in community in Jenkins's work, and I think that there's something really profound in that. It's also very dialogue heavy. While we get kind of omnipresent third person from both points of view, to my recollection, we don't linger too long. It is very kind of like action focused and dialogue focused. So like moving the plot, moving these characters and their development through both word and action, not so much internal reflection, if that makes sense. And while I was initially kind of bummed that we weren't spending more time on like the mission itself, once we got to the mission itself, I was not bummed that we were not spending more time there. And I say that because like obviously I get so far in the book and I'm like, well, we're not there yet, when's it coming? But we were in the home of a very racist Southern woman after Reconstruction. So it was not a pleasant place to be, and the narrative did not make our characters stay there longer than necessary. So while the recovery of the document did feel a little quick in some ways, I was not mad about it because I, like these characters, was happy to be out of there. At the same time, Jenkins is really good in all of her books about really kind of threading the history through everything. So in a way, we are getting a history lesson, but it doesn't feel like we're getting a history lesson because we're seeing that history as it directly impacts our characters, especially through politics. Or here, I believe it was Yellow Fever, talking about like the yellow fever outbreaks in New Orleans and how trains were rerouted and people weren't allowed into the city or out or what have you. So we're seeing the way things impacted daily life. And the history was extra satisfying here because we got some comeuppance for some racists in a way that did not take away from our main romance. And our main romance was steamy, let me tell you. Once that flip got switched from I do not like you to oh maybe I like you, it kept the foot on the gas. There were times I wished that the flip switch was a little bit more of a dimmer switch than a flip switch, but that's a personal preference. I do think that it fits within the tone and the pacing and the writing style that Jenkins has here, and I'm so glad I'm finally able to talk about this book and was able to read it because I was afraid I'd forget things because the HarperCollins strike is over. So if you haven't read this series yet, it is a complete 3-book series. I believe I've talked about all of them at this point over the years, and you should definitely get your hands on it. Okay, and we've talked about this next one already, and there's no way I'm going to be able to fully distill it here because I wasn't able to even fully distill it in its feature Friday, but Our Share of Night by Mariana Enriquez and translated by Megan McDowell, one of my most anticipated books of the year, period. This is our first novel translated into English by Enriquez, who wrote the short story collections Things We Lost in the Fire and The Dangers of Smoking in Bed, which you've surely heard me talk about before. I adore both collections. They are charged and scary and political and personal all at once, and this book kind of distills all of that all at once too, while tracing back at least one section of this book, tracing back pretty particularly to the story Adela's house in Things We Lost in the Fire. So this book starts out with this father and son, Juan and Gaspar, and they are on this road trip to the home of their recently passed wife and mother. But there is more to the story here. Along the way, Juan is not only trying to get in touch with the spirit of his late wife, but he's trying to protect Gaspar from something related to this family. And when we get there, we learn it's because this family is deep in this cult that worships the darkness, and that Juan is the prophet of this cult. And they need Juan as access to their god. And this cult of these very wealthy families internationally, though we are focused on Argentina here, they are dedicated to solving the question of immortality. And so they view Gaspar as the continuation necessary to gain this knowledge and to continue their own lives. And so it looks at horrors on so many levels here. We obviously start with the cult, but we're also looking at class and politics, especially as this book takes place in the midst of and immediately after the dictatorship, and watching the kind of horrors that came from that and how and where those horrors overlapped with the horrors of this cult. But the book keeps going back to the central question of Gaspar and this legacy and whether he can escape it. At the same time, as I mentioned in the feature Friday, there are some incredibly disturbing visuals and considerations here. So if you don't even want that in your conscience, as I've said before, you may want to sit this one out. At the same time, I don't usually consider myself a horror reader, and I was oddly compelled by this. That being said, mileage may vary because I have been reading a lot more things that are being classified as horror recently. It's a line. I used to think that if I could handle it, it wasn't as horrific as maybe thought, but this is pretty unquestionably horrific. There's some really violent imagery, there's some really disturbing imagery. Some of the most traditionally scary, like if you think of just like ghosts, are kind of presented on the periphery early on as just like a given circumstance. This idea that the spirits of the disappeared are just kind of wandering the countryside. At the same time, you have all of this kind of horrific imagery. There are these kind of lulls that feel a little bit more psychological, a little bit more reflective. So it's definitely playing with a kind of like heightening of stakes. It is a full, complete story, a novel, as I said, but each section, is there 5 or 6 sections in here? Let me remind myself, 6. Each section is a fully contained story of its own as well, and they kind of provide revelations of other things as we go forward. So it is really intricately constructed. It definitely harkens back to her short stories, both thematically and in terms of the form. And so I think it's just, like I said, a really ambitious continuation of that work. And I think it's so exciting to see how that work translates to a larger scale, because short stories are a little bit more condensed. They pack a punch that are structurally crafted to really get to the heart of the thing, even if we're dancing around the idea sometimes in Enriquez's work, or we really are playing with the idea of the scary on the periphery, the horrors on the periphery. And here we're moving from that much more contained thing into like a 600-page novel. So it's a much different undertaking. This definitely feels much more epic in terms of the scale, but it still retains a lot of the spirit of that early work. And it is just really interesting to see how they are in conversation with one another. I'm so grateful that we have more Enriquez in translation, even if there are images in my head that just live there now. That's where they live. They're not going anywhere. But I think something really important about her work in terms of like those horrific images, the really gruesome images, the really violent images, is that you can tell that they are stemming from kind of like the political horrors that were witnessed and that this country and these people lived through, because it's the kind of undercurrent of everything. And even knowing not nearly enough about the political situation, I can feel that undercurrent, and I can feel how charged and personal all of this really is at the end of the day. I think that that is what makes a difference in a lot of ways. This isn't horror necessarily for the sake of being voyeuristic in the horror, in the slasher, but it is horror born of trauma and attempting to reconcile and understand things. So I don't know, those are big statements that I can't back up in any way, but that's how I feel about it. And if you are a horror fan, I definitely think you should check this out. And I will be very, very interested to see how people are responding to this, especially people who are more versed in horror than I am, because I'm interested to see how it exists in the larger body of work there as well. So if you think you can handle it, definitely recommend, but I'm never gonna push someone into reading this because it is a lot. And then because I clearly needed a break after the horror of all of that, the only coffee shop AU I am currently accepting, Crumbs by Dani Sterling. This is, I would argue this would be a new adult graphic novel or a young adult graphic novel about 2 young people in this magical world trying to figure it out and come into their own. And there is a little romance involved. Ray is training to be a counselor in this magical world, and she goes to the same bakery every day. Lori is the barista that often helps her and is an up-and-coming musician, or wants to be an up-and-coming musician. So they are both kind of trying to figure out their worlds, and in the meantime they fall in love. But this is complicated by the fact that Ray is training for this council because it takes a lot of her memories, like she has to leave her memories there. It takes a lot of her time. There are a lot of assignments. She's a little frustrated by the council in general because she's a seer, but she can only see things in the present, which is actually really helpful for this council. But then she starts to get little peeks of her powers and seeing into the future, and she wants to explore that, and the council really needs her in the present, so they're not allowing her to explore that to its fullness either, and she's becoming a little discontent. Meanwhile, Lori is getting turned down for a lot of gigs, and he's trying to hide this disappointment from Ray, but in a way that it makes Ray feel like she's not fully being let in. So it's very much about young people, even amidst all of the magic, kind of learning how to navigate in the world, how to navigate relationships with other people in the world, and kind of come into your own, and what decisions kind of have to be made about your future, what sacrifices have to be made made, no matter what choice you end up making. So there is a lot of really deep stuff explored here, but there is also a lot of magic and whimsy, and it is very cute and fun, and I very much enjoyed it, especially after coming off of something as heavy as Our Share of Night. So if you were looking for something that is cute and has depth at the same time, definitely recommend this. So yeah, that was it for February. I will be very interested to hear if you've read these, what you thought, but thank you as usual for hanging out and listening to what I thought about these. I'd love to hear what your February reading looked like as well and how you're feeling going into March, but thanks for hanging out. Read something good, like and subscribe if you feel like it, and yeah, bye.